The shelling has stopped. For the first time in hours, there's silence. But this isn't peace, it's a signal. Across the churned mud and tangled wire of no man's land, shapes detach themselves from the darkness. They don't carry rifles. They're armed with clubs, knives, and grenades. Their faces are blackened with burnt cork. This isn't a battle anymore. It's a hunt, and the trenches, the very holes dug for protection, are about to become tombs. When the artillery fell silent, the real horror of World War I was just beginning. Before the world sank into mud and blood, war was supposed to be glorious. European military leaders, raised on 19th century traditions, had an almost religious faith in the power of the infantry charge. The doctrine was simple, brutal, and to them, beautiful. Thousands of men, bayonets fixed, would advance across the battlefield, their sheer offensive spirit breaking the enemy's will. Every soldier was taught to see the bayonet as the ultimate weapon, a symbol of courage that could shatter enemy lines. German doctrine even focused on a throw-point attack, meant to create an 11-foot kill zone around the soldier. Commanders on all sides clung to this belief, convinced that a sweeping, decisive assault was the key to victory, a war of movement that would be over before modern firepower even came into play. But this grand delusion was annihilated in the opening months of 1914. At battles like Mons and the Marne, entire battalions charging with fixed bayonets were simply erased by machine gun fire. The ground between the armies, soon to be known as no man's land, became a steel sea where men were cut down in droves. The bayonet, the weapon of heroes, was useless against barbed wire and machine gun nests hundreds of yards away. In fact, bayonet wounds would account for less than 1% of casualties throughout the war. By the end of the year, both sides, exhausted and bled white, did the only thing they could to survive. They dug in. The war of movement was over. The stalemate had begun. The trench systems became monstrous, elaborate networks of defense that scarred Europe from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And these weren't just simple ditches. They were complex, multi-layered fortresses. You had a frontline trench, staring into the abyss of no man's land, backed by a support trench, and then a reserve trench even further back, all linked by a maze of communication trenches. This labyrinth was designed so that even if attackers took one trench, they'd be trapped in a deadly crossfire from all the others. And between these opposing worlds lay the most terrifying place on Earth, no man's land. It was a desolate lunar landscape, anywhere from 70 to several hundred meters wide, pockmarked by years of shelling. It was a graveyard of men and equipment, shrouded in a permanent stench of decay. This ground was sown with death. Thick entanglements of barbed wire, sometimes dozens of feet deep, were meant to trap soldiers in the open. The ground was mined, and across this whole expanse, machine gunners and snipers waited, covering every inch of blasted earth, ready to kill anyone foolish enough to show their head. For the millions of soldiers huddled in these ditches, life became a tedious cycle of dread. The stalemate was absolute. To break it would require a new kind of soldier and a much more savage kind of war. Out of this paralysis, a new tactic was born in the darkness. It began a small, stealthy patrol sent into no man's land to gather intelligence or fix wire. But it didn't take long for both sides to see the potential for something more aggressive. The mission shifted from quiet observation to violent assault, small-scale surprise attacks on enemy trenches. These became known as trench raids. While the tactic was refined by many, the very first recorded large-scale raid of the war was an all-Canadian affair. On the night of February 28, 1915, men of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry crept across no man's land near Ypres, Belgium, destroying a German trench before slipping back to their own lines. The Germans, however, were the first to truly systematize this new warfare, creating specialized Sturmkompanie or Stoßtrupps, Stormtroopers. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were elite units trained to master the night. Their method was terrifyingly simple: get as close to the enemy's sentries as possible without a sound and kill them. Once inside the trench, they would unleash maximum chaos in minutes, throwing grenades into dugouts where men were sleeping before melting back into the darkness. The goal was to kill, capture prisoners, destroy defenses, and above all, terrorize the enemy into believing they were never, ever safe. This new primitive form of combat demanded new primitive weapons. The standard-issue rifle, long and clumsy with its bayonet, was pretty much useless in the tight, twisting confines of a trench. Stealth and silence were key, so firearms were often a last resort. Instead, trench raiders armed themselves with an arsenal that would have been familiar to a medieval knight.
Soldiers on both sides crafted their own brutal tools for silent killing. Trench clubs became a staple, often improvised by unit carpenters from a simple wooden stave with a heavy metal object fixed to the end, some studded with hobnails, others weighted with lead. Knives were essential. When mass-produced blades weren't available, soldiers made their own, like the infamous French nail, a gruesome stiletto forged from the steel stakes used for barbed wire. The T-handled push dagger was a favorite of British raiders, its spike blackened to prevent any glint of moonlight. Even entrenching tools, the shovels used to dig the trenches, were sharpened and wielded as deadly axes. When silence was no longer needed, the raiders unleashed modern firepower. Hand grenades were indispensable, and German stormtroopers often carried several into each raid. Pistols like the American .45 caliber M1911 were prized for their stopping power in tight spaces. Some units even unofficially used sawn-off shotguns for their devastating effect. This was the paradox of the Great War. The most industrialized conflict in history had forced soldiers to revert to hacking and bludgeoning each other to death in the mud. While many units conducted raids, some gained a particularly fearsome reputation. The Canadians became renowned as masters of this violent art. While they didn't invent the tactic, their ferocity and meticulous planning made them some of its deadliest practitioners. By late 1915, their raids were becoming miniature, self-contained battles. A perfect example was a large raid led by Lieutenant Colonel Victor Odlum in November 1915. This wasn't just a small patrol, it was a complex operation against German positions near Petit Deux Farm, involving 170 volunteers, all carefully coordinated with artillery. The raiders surprised the defenders, killed many, and hauled back prisoners for intelligence, cementing the Canadians' reputation. They developed tactics like the silent death, where parties would lie in wait in no man's land to ambush German patrols with knives and clubs for maximum psychological effect. For the high command, these raids were invaluable. They believed they kept the troops aggressive and provided a steady stream of intelligence. But for the men who had to blacken their faces and crawl across the wire, the view was often very different. They saw raids as terrifying, often pointless affairs that resulted in heavy casualties, frequently sacrificing a unit's best soldiers for a single prisoner or a few feet of destroyed trench.
A successful trench raid was a masterpiece of planning, stealth, and brutal efficiency. The official objectives were clear: capture prisoners, kill the enemy, destroy machine guns, and grab any maps or documents you could find. But a key unwritten objective was psychological: to shatter the enemy's morale and instill a constant state of fear. It all started in darkness. The raiders, lightly equipped for speed, would crawl out of their own wire and into the hellscape of no man's land. Getting there was often the deadliest part. They had to navigate shell craters and rotting corpses, praying a flare wouldn't suddenly light up the sky and expose them to withering machine gun fire. Sometimes engineers had already cut paths through the enemy wire on previous nights, but often the raiders had to do it themselves, painstakingly snipping strands while trying to remain unheard. Once they reached the enemy trench, the attack was swift and merciless. Sentries were dispatched quietly with a knife or club. Then chaos was unleashed. Grenades were tossed into dugouts to kill sleeping soldiers. The raiders would work their way down a section of the trench, a whirlwind of violence, before the enemy could even mount a response. The entire operation might last only a few minutes. As a German raid on the American 1st Division in November 1917 showed, the attack could be over almost as soon as it began, with the raiders melting back into the darkness with their prisoners before the defenders could even call for help. The journey back was just as perilous, with the added risk of being shot by your own jumpy sentries. But these brutal lessons learned in the nightly crucible of trench raiding weren't wasted. Military commanders, particularly in the German army, realized that the raiders' tactics, speed, surprise, and decentralized command held the key to breaking the stalemate on a much larger scale. The impromptu raiding parties evolved into highly trained, permanent elite units. These were the German Stoßtruppen, or Stormtroopers. They were the pioneers, trained to be the surgical edge of the army. While regular soldiers advanced in lines, stormtroopers were trained to think and act independently in small groups. They were masters of infiltration, equipped with the best close combat weapons, pistols, lots of grenades, and the world's first effective submachine gun, the MP-18. Their job wasn't to fight every enemy soldier, but to bypass strong points, penetrate deep into the enemy's rear, and sow chaos by destroying headquarters and artillery. Other nations followed suit, with the Italians forming the Arditi, or the daring ones. The practice of raiding had created a new philosophy of warfare. It was no longer about brute force, it was about finding the weak points and exploiting them with speed and violence.
The full, terrifying potential of these new tactics was unleashed in the fall of 1917 at the Battle of Caporetto. On the Italian front, a combined Austro-German force, spearheaded by German stormtroopers, did what had been thought impossible for 3 years. They shattered a fortified line. After a short, brutally effective artillery bombardment of high explosives and poison gas, the stormtroopers advanced under the cover of fog and rain. They didn't charge the strongest positions. Instead, they infiltrated the lines through weak points, bypassing fortifications and attacking command centers and artillery from the rear. The effect was catastrophic. The Italian command structure, rigid and unprepared, completely fell apart. Communications were cut, units were isolated, and panic spread like wildfire. The Italian Second Army effectively disintegrated. In a matter of days, the Austro-German forces advanced dozens of kilometers and captured over 265,000 prisoners. It was a stunning demonstration of how infiltration tactics, born from the simple trench raid, could achieve a victory of immense strategic importance. Building on this success, Germany launched its final desperate bid for victory in the spring of 1918, the Kaiserschlacht, or Spring Offensive. Using the same Hutier tactics perfected at Caporetto, dozens of stormtrooper divisions struck the Allied lines on the Western Front. They achieved the greatest advances seen since 1914, proving once again the tactical superiority of infiltration warfare. For a moment, it seemed as if the raiders who once haunted no man's land would win the entire war. But for all their stunning tactical success, the stormtroopers couldn't deliver a strategic victory. The very speed of their advance became their undoing. As they pushed deeper into enemy territory, they outran their supply lines. Food, ammo, and reinforcements simply couldn't keep up. The elite stormtrooper divisions thrown into every attack suffered immense casualties that couldn't be replaced. Germany had gambled everything on its best soldiers, and when they were spent, there was no one left to exploit the breakthroughs they had created.
Meanwhile, the Allies adapted. They developed an elastic defense in depth, leaving their front lines lightly manned to absorb the initial shock, while concentrating their main forces further back. More importantly, the Allies' overwhelming material superiority began to tell. The arrival of vast numbers of American troops provided a limitless pool of manpower. And while the Germans relied on elite infantry, the Allies were mastering a new form of combined arms warfare, coordinating massive artillery barrages with tanks and aircraft to smash through German lines. Stormtrooper tactics were a brilliant solution to the problem of the trench, but they couldn't overcome the hard realities of a global war of attrition. The story of the trench raiders is just one of the many forgotten, brutal realities of the First World War. If you want to uncover more of these hidden histories, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. The story of the trench raider is the central paradox of World War I. It was a conflict defined by the heights of industrial technology, massive artillery, machine guns, airplanes, and poison gas. Yet, in the claustrophobic horror of the trenches, warfare got stripped back to its most primal form. Modern soldiers became medieval warriors, wielding clubs and knives in a desperate struggle for survival. The raiders proved that even in the face of overwhelming firepower, the deciding factor could still be a small group of determined men with sharpened shovels and the will to kill in the dark. And that terrifying step backward reveals a timeless truth about war. Technology doesn't eliminate brutality, it often just forces it into new, more intimate corners. The lessons learned by the Stormtroopers, infiltration, speed, and small unit initiative would directly influence the blitzkrieg tactics of the next World War and still echo in special forces operations today. The nightmare in no man's land showed that no matter how advanced our weapons become, war always finds a way to revert to its most savage essence, a personal, terrifying hunt for blood and survival.